Did you or someone you know ever attend a wedding where the bride or groom was left at the altar? How did it turn out? You see, the first blow came when I was left at the altar. 6 years we'd been together, 4 of those engaged. I thought I knew him inside and out. I never saw it coming. We met in the most mundane of ways, through mutual friends at a local bar. I wasn't looking for anything serious back then. I was just enjoying life, working my job as a graphic designer and spending weekends with friends. But there was something about him. He was different. He was charming in that unassuming way, the kind of guy who would hold the door open for a stranger without making a big deal about it. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest, but he had this quiet confidence that drew me in. Our relationship grew quickly. We had a connection that felt easy, natural. We shared a love for the outdoors, often spending our weekends hiking or camping. He was passionate about photography, and I loved how he saw the world through his lens. He'd capture the simplest moments, a sunbeam filtering through the trees, a squirrel mid-leap, and turn them into something beautiful. We complemented each other in so many ways. He was the calm to my occasional storm, the steady hand that guided me when I felt lost. I was the one who pulled him out of his shell, encouraging him to take risks and embrace the unknown. The proposal was perfect, or so I thought. It was on a snowy evening during a winter hike. We had just reached the top of a hill, and the whole world seemed to be covered in a blanket of white. He got down on one knee, his breath visible in the cold air, and asked me to spend the rest of my life. I said yes, of course. How could I not? It felt like the culmination of everything we had built together. We spent the next few years planning our wedding, but it was more than just planning. It was a labor of love. Every Sunday, our friends would come over, and we'd have BBQs, sit around and map out every detail. We didn't want anything traditional. We wanted a wedding that was uniquely ours. He was so enthusiastic about it all, talking about how wonderful it would be to have a small, intimate ceremony, followed by a picnic and a big bonfire. He would say things like, "We don't need all that fancy stuff. Our love is what's real." His excitement was infectious. I was so sure we were on the same page. Then, the day that was supposed to be the happiest of our lives arrived. I remember waking up that morning with butterflies in my stomach, but the good kind. The kind that tell you something amazing is about to happen. I slipped into my dress, a simple, elegant gown that we had picked out together. My friends were there, helping me with my hair, my makeup, making sure everything was perfect. We laughed, reminisced, and toasted to the future. Everything felt right. But as the time to walk down the aisle approached, something felt off. The ceremony was supposed to start at noon, but by 12:15 there was still no sign of it. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that maybe he was just running late. Maybe he got stuck in traffic or had a last-minute issue with his suit. But as the minutes ticked by, my heart started to race. I could see the guests starting to shift uncomfortably in their seats, whispering to each other, exchanging nervous glances. Then my phone rang. It was him. My heart leaped, thinking he was calling to tell me he was on his way, that everything was fine. But when I answered, his voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. He said he couldn't do it, just like that. No apology, no real explanation. Just that he couldn't go through with it. I was stunned, paralyzed by the weight of his words. It felt like the ground had opened up beneath me, like I was free falling into some dark, endless void. I don't remember much of what happened immediately after that. It's all a blur of confusion, pain, and disbelief. I remember my friends rushing to my side, their faces pale with shock. I remember the officiant trying to say something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. I remember the guests, some of whom had traveled from across the country, awkwardly shuffling out of the venue, avoiding eye contact, unsure of what to say or do. The beautiful day we had planned, the one we had poured our hearts into, had crumbled to dust in an instant. For a long time, I couldn't bring myself to go back to our apartment. I stayed with my best friend, who practically had to drag me out of bed each morning. I was in a fog, barely functioning, just going through the motions. The hardest part was the silence. The absence of him, the lack of any explanation. I kept replaying that phone call in my head, dissecting every word, every pause, trying to understand where it all went wrong. But there were no answers, only more questions. I didn't hear from him for weeks. When I finally did, it was through a letter. Not even the decency of a face-to-face conversation. In it, he said that he had been overwhelmed, that the idea of marriage had started to feel like a trap. He wrote about how he had always struggled with commitment, how he felt like he was losing himself in the relationship, but the words felt hollow, like excuses wrapped up in pretty language. There was no real apology, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. He just walked away, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life we had built together. People always say that time heals all wounds, but I'm not sure that's entirely true. Time dulls the pain, yes, but the scars remain. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself thinking about him, about what we had, about what could have been. I wonder if he ever regrets his decision, if he ever thinks about me, about us. But those thoughts are fleeting. I've learned to push them aside, to focus on the present, on the life I've built for myself since then. I eventually moved out of the apartment we had shared, finding a place of my own on the other side of town. It was a small, cozy space, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I started focusing on my work, throwing myself into new projects, taking on more clients, trying to keep my mind occupied. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and slowly, bit by bit, started to rebuild my life. There were moments when I thought I might never be able to trust someone again. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. One day, I met someone new. It wasn't love at first sight, far from it, but there was something about him, something familiar yet different. He was kind, patient, and understanding. He didn't try to rush me into anything, didn't pressure me to move faster than I was ready. He just let me be, and that was exactly what I needed. I remember standing there, still in my wedding dress, looking out at all our friends and family. The disbelief hadn't fully hit me. It was like I was in a movie, watching myself from a distance. I could see the concerned faces, the whispered conversations, the guests trying to make sense of what had just happened. But instead of breaking down, I forced a smile and told everyone he'd gotten cold feet, but that we could still have the pic. So, we did. I walked around that picnic, trying to laugh it off, joking about how he was probably just too scared to settle down. I made light of it like it was no big deal, just a little hiccup in our otherwise perfect love story. People tried to comfort me, saying things like, "He'll come around," and "You two are meant to be." I nodded along, pretending to believe them, but inside, I was numb. I don't think I even tasted the food. I was just going through the motions, my mind somewhere far away. The strangest part was what happened afterward, or rather, what didn't happen. There was no big confrontation, no tearful apologies, no angry outbursts. When I got back to the house later that evening, he was sitting on the couch, watching TV like it was any other day. There was no awkwardness, no tension, just silence. I remember standing in the doorway, still in that damn wedding dress, just staring at him, waiting for him to say something. Anything. But he didn't. He just glanced up, gave me a small smile, and asked if I wanted to order pizza. I didn't know what to do, so I said yes. We ate pizza, watched some show, and went to bed like nothing had happened. A week later, he moved out. There was no discussion, no explanation. He packed a bag, said he needed some space, and left. I didn't try to stop. I think a part of me was too exhausted, too emotionally drained to care. I figured he needed time to sort himself out, and honestly, so did I. But then, 2 months later, he called. Said he missed me, that he was sorry for how things had turned out, and asked if he could come back. And like a fool, I let him. I figured we just had a rough patch, that things would go back to normal. And for a while, they did. We slipped back into our routine, like nothing had happened. We didn't talk about the wedding, didn't discuss why he had left. It was like we had both decided to erase that day from our memory, to pretend it never happened. I threw myself into work, into trying to rebuild what we had lost. He seemed happy enough, more attentive even. It was almost like those months apart had done us some good. But looking back, I can see that it was just the calm before the storm. A little over a year later, I was in a bad car accident. It was serious. Spinal injuries, surgeries, the works. I don't remember much about the crash itself, just the sound of screeching tires, the feeling of weightlessness as the car spun out of control. And then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines, with a dull, persistent pain in my back. My first thought was, is this really? And then I saw him sitting by my bedside, holding my hand. For a brief moment, I thought maybe this was the universe's way of bringing us closer, of giving us a second chance. He was there after all. He had stayed by my side, hadn't he? But as soon as I started my first round of surgeries, the reality of our situation came crashing down. The doctors were talking about a long recovery process, about the possibility that I might never walk again, and I could see the fear in his eyes. At first he tried to be supportive, showing up for appointments, sitting with me through physical therapy, but I could tell it was wearing on. He started to pull away, spending less time at the hospital, making excuses about work and other commitments. I tried to be understanding, tried to tell myself that he was just stressed, that this was hard for him too, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Then one day, he just told me. No build-up, no warning. He just looked at me with those same eyes that had once promised forever and said, "I don't love you enough to go through this with." Just like that, he walked away. I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines, barely able to move, and he left me. It was like the floor had been ripped out from under me all over again. But this time, there was no pretending, no joking at all. This was real, and it was devastating. I tried to keep it together, tried to focus on my recovery, but the emotional pain was almost worse than the physical. I kept replaying his words in my head over and over, trying to make sense of them, trying to figure out what I had done wrong. But there was no answer, no reason that could justify what he had done. He was just gone, and I was alone, facing a future that looked nothing like the one we had once planned. The weeks that followed were some of the darkest of my life. I struggled to find the will to keep going, to keep fighting. There were days when I wanted to give, when the pain and the loneliness felt too overwhelming to bear. But somewhere, deep inside, there was a tiny spark, a stubborn determination that refused to let me quit. I started to focus on the small victories. The first time I sat up on my own. The first time I managed to move my toes. The first time I took a step with the help of a walk. Each one felt like a monumental achievement, a reminder that I was still here, still fighting. And slowly that spark began to grow, and slowly that it wasn't easy. Every day was a struggle, a battle against the pain, against the fear, against the doubt that threatened to consume me. But with the help of my friends, my family, and the incredible medical staff who never gave up on me, I started to make progress. I learned to walk again, first with assistance, then on my own. It was slow and it was painful, but it was progress. As I focused on my physical recovery, I also started to work on healing emotionally. I went to therapy, talked through the trauma, the heartbreak, the betrayal. It was hard, digging up all those painful memories, but it was necessary. I had to confront what had happened, had to face the reality of the man I had loved and lost in order to move forward. Months passed, and with each day, I grew a little stronger, a little more confident. I started to see a future for myself again. One that didn't include him. I realized that I was more than just a victim of circumstance, more than just someone who had been left behind. I was a survivor, a fighter, and I had a life to live. And then, one day, I received a letter. I hadn't heard from him since the day he walked out of the hospital. I hadn't expected to. In the letter, he apologized, said he had been a coward, that he couldn't handle the pressure, the responsibility. He wrote about how he had been struggling with his own demons, how he had been too weak to stand by me when I needed him the most. But again, the words felt hollow, like excuses dressed up as explanations. He said he hoped I could forgive him, that he wished me the best in life. There was no mention of coming back, no plea for a second chance, just an apology and a goodbye. I sat with that letter for a long time, reading and rereading the words, trying to figure out how I felt. Part of me wanted to scream, to throw the letter away, to curse him for everything he had put me through. But another part of me just felt sad, not for me, but for him. He had lost something too, something he would probably never fully understand. He had lost the chance to be with someone who would have stood by him, no matter what. And that was his burden to carry, not mine. So I didn't respond. I folded the letter up, put it away, and decided that was the end of it. I had spent enough time on him, enough time grieving a life that was never meant to be. It was time to move on, to focus on the life that was waiting, the life I was determined to build for myself. It felt eerily familiar, almost like déjà vu. Just like when he left me at the altar, I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't even really react. It was like my body had shut down, protecting me from the full force of the pain that was too overwhelming to bear. I was in too much pain, both physically and emotionally, to fight. He left me in that hospital bed, and just like that, Almost 8 years of my life was over. Our families were close, our lives intertwined, and yet it was like he simply evaporated from my world, leaving behind nothing but a void where he used to be. The recovery was brutal, and not just in the physical sense. The surgeries, the physical therapy, the countless hours spent learning to walk again, all of that was grueling. But it was the emotional recovery that nearly broke. When you've spent so long with someone, it's like they become a part of you, like they're stitched into the very fabric of your being. And suddenly, half of me was missing. The life we'd built together, the future we'd planned, it all disappeared in an instant, leaving me to pick up the pieces alone. At first, I didn't know how to cope. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my heart reaching out for someone who wasn't there. The loneliness was suffocating, and I couldn't escape it, no matter how hard I tried. Friends and family tried to be there for me, but it was hard to let them in. I was embarrassed, ashamed even, that I had let this happen to me again, that I had trusted someone who, in the end, didn't have the strength to stay. But somewhere in the midst of all that pain, a small part of me refused to give up. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was a survival instinct. But I knew I had to rebuild myself from the ground up. I threw myself into healing, both body and soul. I took classes, things I had always been curious about, but never had the time. I learned to kayak, something that felt impossibly difficult at first, but eventually became a symbol of my newfound strength. I made new friends, people who didn't know my past, who didn't see me as the woman who had been left behind twice, but just as me. I even forced myself to start dating. It was terrifying at first. The thought of opening myself up to someone new, of risking that kind of pain again, felt like an insurmountable challenge. There were dates where I cried in the bathroom, dates where I felt nothing at all, and dates where I almost gave up. But little by little, I started to feel whole. I started to realize that my worth wasn't tied to the man who had left me, that I was strong, resilient, and capable of building a life that was mine alone. 2 years after he left me, I met my husband. It wasn't one of those whirlwind romances you see in movies. There were no grand gestures or dramatic confessions of love. But from the moment I met him, I felt something different. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating and stale, heavy emotion. With him, everything was different. He wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But we fit together in a way that made me realize just how much I had been missing. There was no need to pretend, no need to put on a brave face or hide my scars. He saw me for who I was, flaws and all, and he loved me anyway. With him, I didn't feel like I had to constantly prove myself or worry about being enough. I could just be, and that was enough. As our relationship grew, I started to see the differences between what I had with him and what I had with my ex. My ex and I were comfortable. Familiar. We had a history together that felt like a safety net, something to fall back on when times got tough. But that wasn't enough. Comfort isn't the same as happiness, and familiarity isn't the same as love. With my husband, there was joy, adventure, and a kind of love I never knew was possible. He brought out the best in me, challenged me to grow, to push beyond the limits I had unknowingly placed on myself. We explored the world together, took risks, and created a life filled with laughter, passion, and an unshakable bond. I learned that love isn't just about finding someone who makes you feel safe. It's about finding someone who makes you want to be better, who inspires you to live fully, without fear. I won't say that it was easy. There were moments of doubt, moments where the ghost of my past threatened to pull me back into that dark place. But he was always there, steady and strong, never wavering in his support. He didn't try to fix me, didn't try to erase my pain. He just held my hand and walked with me through it, giving me the space and the love I needed to heal.